Hello, this is a teacher summary of Act 3 of the Duchess of Malfi. I'll go through each of the scenes. In an Act 5 tragedy, traditionally Act 3 is the turning point, it's the point of no return. This is the part from which this play no longer can be seen as having any hope, and that the path for tragedy is set forward from now. Indeed, the play is the tragic history of the Duchess of Malfi, so audiences would know about this being a tragedy from the beginning, therefore dramatic irony was created. In terms of time, there's been an ellipsis. Time has moved on. The Duchess is no longer the young, beautiful Duchess. She's aging, she contemplates her looks, she's going grey. The audience have some sympathy for her. And Act 3 is the beginnings of her tragic hero status. We see a genuine love for Antonio, and when towards the end of the act she realizes her fate, she starts to begin to get tragic hero status, and we'll look at that a little bit more closely. She's defiant. When her secret is out and her marriage is revealed, she says, "I am married. Why might I not marry?" She says, "My reputation is safe." It's hard not to have some sympathy for her argument. This act continues to have lots of comments about women. Rather like Bosola to the old woman in the last act, we've got Ferdinand commenting on the Duchess being a hideous thing. So, in summaries, tragedy is looming, it's being foreshadowed at various points. In tragedy, we often get lots of comments relating to fate, fortune, and destiny, and so start to look out for those. But some interesting themes that are continued in this act are highlighted below: class, true identity, reputation and honour, hypocrisy, loyalty and betrayal, and fortitude in the face of disaster. I've taken a couple of slides from Mr. Dore here just to give a summary overview of scenes 1 and 2. I'm not going to read through them, but you can as part of this presentation. What's interesting though is that the Duchess is viewed by the general public as a strumpet. Why? Because she's had 2 or 3 more children. And this opens up that theme of reputation that's explored by Antonio, Bosola, and the Duchess later on in the act, and also is commented on by various other characters. So I think it's an important part of the play in many ways as a theme. So we'll be looking at that a little bit. She's referred to, she is a strumpet, say the general public, according to Delio, showing how women's reputations have been always associated with sexual reputation, perhaps. And you could compare that with how women are viewed in the Merchant's Tale. There's an interesting exchange between Bosola and Ferdinand towards the end of the scene. Bosola refuses to flatter Ferdinand, unlike, say, Placebo with January. He says, "You're your own chronicle and gracefully flatter yourself." And it leaves Ferdinand thinking about himself and what great men are like, and how they're ruined because they don't have great friends to check their own beliefs and all their defects. And perhaps there's a little glimmer of self-knowledge there. He knows that he doesn't have anyone to keep his own faults and defects in check. And perhaps we should look out for glimmers of self-knowledge in Ferdinand in Acts 4 and 5, because usually in tragedies, self-knowledge comes to characters, but it comes too late. Okay, again, I've taken one of Mr. Dore's slides here just to summarise what goes on in Act 3, Scene 2. And what we're going to be looking at is the paradox of Bosola's character, the intelligentsia who's deceitful and hypocritical and a liar, but who will always tell the truth as well. And we have the truthful genuine characters forced into deception, having to pretend that there's been a burglary, having to lie the noble lie, and for Antonio's reputation to be destroyed in order to save him. So that theme of appearance versus reality is going to come through a lot in this particular act. What pleasures can two lovers find in sleep, says the Duchess. Again, shows us that, you know, she has real sexual desire for her husband, Antonio. And this leads into an interesting, and so I suppose that's a comparison you can make about sexual desire in both texts. This leads to an interesting debate about marriage, which again is something that you could compare. Cariola says she'll never take her husband. Cariola is one of the loyal characters to the Duchess, showing us that women don't always betray, and she's often forgotten about. And Antonio says, no, fight on a single life. Married life is really much better. And in many ways he mimics the speech of January, or even the ironic encomium of the merchant. But Cariola is not convinced, and she throws back a question and says, if I was proposed to by a man, and wisdom, riches and beauty was personified in 3 different young men, which man should I choose? Antonio finds that a difficult question to answer. He doesn't know what would be the best person to marry, a wise person, a rich person, or a beautiful person. And he then goes on to change the subject. But it's interesting little exchange that perhaps this idea about the role of marriage could be compared in both texts. In Act 3, Scene 2, Cariola and Antonio conceal themselves behind the arras, behind the curtains. This is a particular trope that we often find in tragedies. Hamlet's father-in-law, prospective father-in-law, hides behind the curtains when Hamlet is wooing Ophelia, and then he mistakenly kills him. So audiences would be familiar with this kind of stage direction. And again, it highlights dramatically on stage the idea of appearance and reality concealing the truth. Okay. Ferdinand enters, and we see before his entrance, the Duchess thinking about perhaps she's going to live a doomed life, and if she's going to live or die, she's going to do both like a prince. So we get the first glimmerings of her tragic hero status. Ferdinand comes in, and then she defies him. She says, why might I not marry? I've not gone about this to create any new world or custom. And you're too strict in this, too willful. My reputation is safe. So the secret is out. Antonio gives her a poignard, a dagger, with the idea that he wants her to take her own life. And again, it's a phallic symbol of his kind of perverse desire and control, possible sexual control of his sister. So it's a threat, and also a desire that he wants her to kill herself. When he leaves, Antonio and Cariola come from behind the curtains, and immediately Antonio believes Cariola has betrayed them. So again, it's another suggestion that even the good characters don't really have much trust in the loyalty of women. And Cariola, like the Duchess, is also defiant. You know, their characters often mirror each other in tragedies. You should make a note of that. In the way that Antonio mirrors Bosola, Cariola mirrors the defiance of her mistress. Pray, sir, when you do shoot me, look in my heart and you will find mine innocence. Again, always try to remember the different presentations of women in your texts. Cariola stays loyal to the end. Act 3 continues, in a play of deception, even the honest characters must deceive in order to exist in a distrustful world. And so, in order to escape the clutches of Ferdinand, Antonio and the Duchess decide to fake a robbery, and then she accuses him of cooking the books, of embezzling her accounts, and that he must flee. The noble lie then, because it must shield our honours, forces good characters to lie. Okay, and this then leads to, once Ferdinand is seen as, his reputation is gone and he's seen as someone who's a liar and embezzler, people start to turn on him. And so this theme of reputation is explored. Immediately after he flees, the Duchess says, I would like to know your opinion of this Antonio, and various officers say various things. First one accuses him of being a Jew, which is interesting in that it shows the anti-Semitism that is reflected in many plays at this time, such as The Jew of Malta, The Merchant of Venice, and various other plays as well. Is this the represented anti-Semitism of Italians, or does it also reflect the anti-Semitism of the audience of the English and the playwrights? It's an interesting discussion. Others call him proud, arrogant, accuse him of being an hermaphrodite who never liked women. So again, the idea of his sexuality is called into account as part of his reputation. And the Duchess tries to sound Bosola out about what did she think, what did he think of Antonio, and she says, well, of course he was basely descended. The irony is, we know she's married to the man, but she says he's of low birth. And Bosola says, Madam, will you examine a man's pedigree than his virtues? Will you give more account to his birth than his actual virtues? Sure, he was too honest. He was a most unvoweled jewel. Now, the thing about Bosola, the paradox of Bosola, because he tells lies and the truth, we never know really if he's telling the truth here and he believes this, or if he's just saying this because he suspects the Duchess is married to him and has a child by him, and he's trying to trick her. So we've got the paradox of a Duchess creating a noble lie and ruining the reputation of her husband in order for him to escape the clutches of Bosola. And we've got Bosola, who's a liar, a deceiver, and intelligentsia, saying truthful things about Antonio, but is his lie defending his reputation in order to trap the Duchess? So you've got this kind of revolving idea of truth and lies surrounding the Duchess and Bosola at this stage in the play. And Webster kind of rotates this constantly in this act. But a lot of what Bosola says about Antonio is true. His virtue and his form deserved a far better fortune. And an honest statesman to a prince is like a cedar planted by a river. You know, they support each other. And again, the idea of a cedar tree reminds us of the imagery of the fountain at the start of the play, and it also reminds us of how trees are referred to in The Merchant's Tale. The laurel tree of January and the pear tree is something that you can talk about and compare. So, in a way, the Duchess falls into Bosola's trap, and she reveals to Bosola, once she's convinced that Bosola is on Antonio's side, she says, you speak of my husband. And that leads to quite an ironic speech by Bosola, but that can be also taken on face value as a truth. He says, can this ambitious age have so much goodness in it as to prefer a man merely for worth, without these shadows of wealth and painted honours? Is it possible that a man can rise through his virtues rather than his birth? Is it possible in this world? Is this world a meritocracy? Bosola asks. Okay, and that's kind of an interesting question to ask to Webster's audience, who are made up of the wealthy of the court. The audience of Webster is in an inside theatre. There tended to be a much wealthier audience of higher noble birth than perhaps the mixed audience of Shakespeare's Globe. And so they're being asked the question whether wealth is just merely a shadow and honours are merely painted, and that we should consider a man for his worth and his virtues, which is strangely subversive by Webster, I think. So the theme of concealment continues with the Duchess here, and Bosola suggests that she feigns a pilgrimage. That in order to get with her husband again, she should pretend to go on a pilgrimage. She should feign a pilgrimage to the Lady of Loretto. It's a school up in Hertfordshire. And Cariola doesn't like this. She says you shouldn't pretend, you shouldn't jest with religion. This feigned pilgrimage is not a good idea. Okay, so Cariola is giving a warning to the Duchess. She says this is not a good idea. You don't play with religion. It's bad news. It's bad luck. But the Duchess refuses to accept her advice. Thou art a superstitious fool. The Duchess in January are perhaps more alike than we can imagine. Both of them dismiss the wise advice of their courtiers or their servants. So we come to the end of the scene with Bosola's soliloquy. Soliloquies are important. You should consider what they do. They do one of four things. They perhaps reveal a character's indecision, or a character comes to some truth about the world, or some truth about themselves. And I think in this scene, Bosola is asking himself, well, what am I? You know, this base quality of intelligentsia. He's got a kind of self-knowledge, which is also important in soliloquies. He realizes that his skill, his quality is base, it's low. And he realizes that in this act, he's like a devil. He's like a politician. His comparison to a politician does the devil's work, but in a soft, silent way. An anvil makes a loud noise, but if you quilt it, it makes no noise. A politician is a skillful devil's worker. And in a sense, that's how he sees himself. He's doing the work of the devil. But he's going to do it anyway, because he's after gain and commendation. He's after preferment and to rise up in the world. And he certainly is going to be rewarded for this. And it makes him question the nature of reward for doing bad deeds. And it's like men that paint weeds to the life are praised. So men that don't bring flowers and beauty to the world, but like paint weeds or bring weeds out, or they paint nasty things such as weeds. People are rewarded in this world for doing bad things. It's interesting, he starts with politicians. And in some ways, you could see this as an attack on the very people watching the play, the people of the court. So we have the paradox of Bosola's soliloquy. Soliloquies characters usually tell the truth. He's telling the truth about himself, he's telling the truth about his acts, and he's also telling the truth about the world. A world in which the corrupt who do corrupt deeds are rewarded for their corruption. Act 3, Scene 3 is a very small scene. Again, it's one of those scenes in which Malatest is ridiculed. He's been promoted to general, and he's pretending to be a soldier, a little bit like Boris there in the photo. He's pretending to be something he's not. Again, the idea of deception is there, even in minor scenes in which a character is having, is being ridiculed. And in a short exchange between Pescara and Delio, they comment on Ferdinand and the Cardinal in such a way as we start to see the growing sense of them being associated with all things unholy, even devilish. In such form, deformed silence witches whisper their charms, says Delio as he watches what Ferdinand and the cardinal are saying, but he can't hear what they're saying. And again, the cardinal, angry with his sister, says, does she make religion her riding hood? You know, is it merely a disguise? Okay, that's an interesting quote that he could apply to himself. Is he merely a cardinal in disguise? Is Malatest putting on the clothes of a soldier but isn't really, reminds us of symbolically the cardinal putting on the clothes of a cardinal but isn't. And Ferdinand's response is typically Ferdinand. He thinks her fault and beauty are blended together and they show like leprosy. Again, he uses a simile of disease, which again reflects his own diseased mind, this tempestuous and perverse nature. Okay, as the scene develops, we start to see references to fortune and fate. And this is typical of tragedies, that tragedies, once they set in motion, fate, destiny and fortune, you cannot be controlled by mere man. And that goes back to Greek tragedy in that sense, that man is at the mercy of the gods and fortune. And in a way, this play takes some of the form of Greek tragedy. We've got in this scene the symbolic dressing of the cardinal becoming a general, becoming a warlord. And again, it heightens that sense of hypocrisy of this cardinal changing one costume to another. And it heightens that sense of, for a Protestant audience, the hypocrisy of how they consider the Catholic Church as a warmongering, empire-building association rather than a true religion. And so he highlights that hypocrisy by putting on these warlike clothes. Again, the cardinal's going to war, but symbolically he's putting on a mask, he's putting on a costume, just like Malatest in the previous scene. And we have various pilgrims that are commenting on this. This is very much a kind of mime scene. There's a song going on, and if you look at the song, there's lots of references to honours and virtues. And again, they're probably in juxtaposition to what we see on the stage. You know, the lack of honour and the lack of virtue in the cardinal, while at the same time it's being sung about celebrating his honour and virtue. So there's a kind of, the suggestion of appearance versus reality is dramatised on stage. And that classical dramatisation is also shown in the pilgrims, who are rather like a Greek chorus. They're commenting on the action that they're seeing, and they are merely narrating what the public think of both the cardinal and the Duchess. It's interesting that they comment on the Duchess having made an ill choice of marriage. Why did she match herself unto so mean a person, says one pilgrim. But the other pilgrim says, the cardinal, however, bears himself much too cruel, it should be. So there's a kind of chorus, Greek chorus commentating on the action, and we're watching the action in kind of silent mime scene. And that kind of prefigures the mime scene that we get a little later in Act 4. Okay, what I think is important about Act 3, Scene 5 is the growing tragic hero status of the Duchess. All right. A tragic hero has to conform to certain tropes, and that's laid down almost by Greek tragedy as well, with Aristotle, and that they must show kind of a heroic nature in facing their fortune and destruction. And the Duchess truly knows now that there's a sense of this is going to be an unhappy ending in that first quote. And her and her husband are about to separate because they think, both of them think it will be foolish to be found together, at least apart. They might have a bit more of a chance, at least one might survive. And in the eternal church, sir, I do hope we shall not part thus. I think this is an important quote. If we see Ferdinand and the cardinal being further associated with the devil, and in the imagery that's used, they are seen as unholy, the Duchess is being configured to be seen as holy. And the eternal church, or heaven, suggests that even though she's facing tragedy, she will survive in an eternal justice system. That in this tragedy, even though she will die, there's a sense that there will be eternal salvation. There will be a moral universe in which she will survive, and that's important. And again, throughout the act and the scene, you're going to start to see references to death. You know, his kiss is colder than an anchorite kissing a dead man's skull. Lots of similes foreshadowing the eventual end. My heart's turned to a heavy lump of lead, which will sound my danger. Usually, to sound out something, to make the depth, you would put a plumb of lead into the water to work out how deep it is. And so that metaphor of lead to sound, to find out my danger, is a foreshadowing their end. And the Duchess says, my laurel is all withered. You might refer perhaps to the comparison with January, and again the comparison to trees, the metaphors of trees that are used throughout both texts. But in this case, the Duchess talks about her laurel. Her life is on its way. It's going to, her life force is going to die eventually. Whereas January sees his as eternally youthful. Again, more references to fortune moving swiftly, is accelerating now. What else makes this Duchess heroic is her defiance in the face of death. I would have my ruin be sudden, she says. She's taken on a heroic status of the man. Whether she is to die soon or whether she will die as a prince. Bosola tells her to forget the base fellow of her husband. He's just a base man, which is the opposite. Their conversation now changes to what it was in the previous scene. And she says, were-eyed man, I'd beat that counterfeit face into thy other, which is a great insult, which kind of continues the theme of the hypocrisy of Bosola, that she now fronts it, and she sees him for what he truly is, okay, which is, the mask is now taken off. And she says about her husband, say that he were born mean. Man is most happy when his own actions be arguments and examples of his virtues. So again, the court audience are being asked to consider, are they happy in their own actions and their virtues? And, do they live up to their own virtues? Or are they, rather like Bosola, masking and concealing their own corruption? It's kind of an interesting question. Okay, so Act 3 ends with a defiance speech from the Duchess. Whenever a heroic character is given quite a long speech, a monologue in this case, it's always worthy of close examination, particularly when it's at the end of an act, and particularly at the end of Act 3s, which are naturally climactic. And I don't think it's a soliloquy because Bosola's there. And I think it's interesting that Bosola's there because in Act 4, I think Bosola is quite touched by how the Duchess presents herself in facing her own destruction. And some people argue that he has a kind of turnaround, and maybe it's a result of witnessing the truly heroic nature of the Duchess. And she refers to a kind of story about two fish meeting, a dogfish and a salmon. And the dogfish is rather haughty and says to the salmon, who do you think you are? You shouldn't be in this area. You're low birth. And the salmon says, our value can never be truly known till in the fish's basket we be shown. And the moral is that men are most often valued at their highest when they're most wretched. And again, that's kind of interesting because you've got the reference to fish and marketplaces that are referred to in the January, looking for a bride, and what kind of bride he wants. It doesn't want any houndfish, or he has the skin of a houndfish, but he doesn't want any old fish. I can't remember the quote now, but you might refer to, how people are seen as animals and compared to fish in many ways. I think it's a pickerel and a dogfish are referenced. And again, it's in his preference for young meat but mature fish. So I think that's kind of interesting that really when we are most wretched, do we see our own value and are we valued most highly? And perhaps Bosola values the Duchess when she's most wretched, and that comes in the turning point of Bosola in Act 4 in some ways. And what's most impressive about the Duchess, therefore, at the end of this act is she's armed against misery. She's bent to all sways of the oppressor's will. She's facing her demise, as she says, like a prince, like a true heroic character. So what Webster's doing is he's imbuing her with true heroic status. And she ends the act on saying there's no deep valley but near some great hill, you know. So we might have pits and depths, and what is the great hill? Maybe it's her, you know, her stature, or she sees misery as associated with, you know, there's a greater view, maybe heaven at the end of it. But what we're left with in her rhyming couplet at the end, and rhyming couplets always kind of sum up something about a character or the scene, is this sense that she's armed against her inevitable tragedy, and that tragedy is finally inevitable here, and that takes us to the climax of the act, and that gives us Act 4.